In 1975, Erno Rubik patented his famous magic cube in his native Hungary. But it was the efforts of Ideal Toy Corporation in the United States that truly turned this item into an international hit. Recently, we caught up with Stewart Sims, who at the time was the marketing director of the toy division of Ideal Toys, and who was intimately involved in the process, and he shared his stories with us.
And I was the marketing manager in the toy division. And we had a marketing manager in games and a marketing manager in dolls as well.
I see. Okay, and describe just a quick thumbnail sketch, if you would, what exactly that job entailed at Ideal, because we have found that at different toy companies, person in charge of marketing meant different things. To give you an example, if you were in charge of marketing at Lewis Marks and Company, you were not in charge of marketing. Louis was still in charge of marketing.
That's true. Well, at Ideal, at that time, our deal was trying to, and I think many of the toy companies were trying to adopt a sort of a packaged goods marketing model where they had a product manager who was usually responsible for the development of the product, and a marketing manager was responsible for uh, the advertising, the communication strategy, dealing with the sales force, and so forth. And so that was my role generally, was dealing with the sales force on the products line, helping develop the commercials with the advertising agency, developing the media strategy, and whatever promotional activities we engaged in as well.
How did Ideal Toys end up with Rubik's Cube? What did you do in that process? How did that all develop?
Okay, well, a little bit of background.
Okay.
The Rubik's Cube was actually developed in Hungary by Erno Rubik. And it was designed initially he was an assistant professor at a school of interior design. And he conceived this idea of how do you create something that's a multi-dimensional object that is manipulable in all forms, in all directions. And so he originally didn't create it, I think, as a puzzle. The puzzle itself was, how do I create this object which is able to be rotated around an axis, and everything stays together and moves in different directions.
I
Once he
see.
had done
So
that,
kind of a teaching aid.
well, I think so. It was an intellectual challenge and a teaching aid. I think it was something I'm sure it was something he presented to his class to try to do. Once he did that, I think he understood that he also had something that was actually more than a teaching aid. It could be a product.
Mhm.
And he eventually licensed it to a Hungarian company called Polytechnica, which was a cooperative. At that time, there were different types of companies in Hungary, one of them being a cooperative. The model for that was a relatively small business where everybody earned the same salary as people who were in state-owned enterprises. But if the company was profitable at the end of the year, those profits could be distributed to the people in the cooperative. So he did it, and it became a very popular toy in Hungary. As a result of that, the Hungarian government they had a variety of trading companies, each responsible for specific industry segments. One of them was called Consumex. Consumex was responsible for the export of consumer products, toys, other types of novelties. And they would take it to the Nuremberg Toy Fair, which was the largest toy fair in Europe, and try to interest companies in acquiring the rights to sell it. They did that a couple of times without much success. And so as a result, the person who was the second person in charge of Consumex, a man named Martin Fee, Alexander Martin Fee, contacted a friend of his, a high school classmate named Tibor Latzi, who lived in Vienna, and asked Tibor if he would help them find a distributor for it in the West. Tibor was kind of their agent, the Consumex agent working in the West. Tibor had decided to approach the largest game company in Germany, a company called Ravensburg. And so he was at the Ravensburg booth about to present Rubik's Cube to Ravensburg. It happened at that time that another person, a guy named Tom Kramer, who was a Hungarian that had left Hungary after the Second World War. He was actually interned, and then he fled to Israel and ultimately went to the UK, who was now a toy inventor, was at the booth at the same time. And he struck up a conversation with Tibor. And very quickly they realized that they were both Hungarian, even though they started in German. And Tom said, "What are you doing?" And Tibor said, "Well, I'm here to try to present this product to Ravensburg." Tom said, "Not a good idea, because Ravensburg's primary distribution channels are in Germany, secondarily in Europe, but they're not a promotional toy company. I deal with toy companies US toy companies that are promotional toy companies and have branches all over the world. Why don't you and I form a handshake agreement, and I will try to find a distributor in the West who is a promotional toy company." So Tom then presented it to a number of toy companies in the United States. I don't know all of them, but certainly he presented it to Hasbro and Bradley and Parker Brothers, and I'm sure others as well, among them being Ideal Toy. He presented it initially to our VP of product development and R&D, a man named Julie Cooper. And Julie was, I think, nominally interested, but as I understand it, the original presentation involved a fairly significant commitment on our part, more so than Julie thought was appropriate. So nobody knew about it because Tom had presented it to Julie. And what happened was in June of the year, at the end of June, we always had a line review of all the products that we were planning on presenting at Toy Fair, which was in February. It was kind of a final line review before everything really was committed to in manufacturing. And so we were going through all of the products that were in the line. And there were a series of executives, head of sales, head of marketing, head of product development, Julie, obviously, Lionel, the president of the company, the head of finance, the head of manufacturing, head of sales. So there were about 10 of us at the table. And one of the people at the table was the guy, Julie's number 2 person, a man named Artie Albert, who was sort of fiddling with this product at the table. And since we'd all seen the line many times, Lionel turned to Artie and he said, "Artie, what are you doing?" And Julie said, "Well, this is a product that Tom Kramer brought us. It's a Hungarian puzzle. Puzzles really don't sell, but it's interesting." And Lionel said, "Well, look, we've all seen the line before. Why don't we at least tell us a little bit more about this?" And Julie then explained that this was a major product in Hungary, and that Tom had acquired the rights for it and presented it to us, and that the Hungarians were looking for a significant contribution, a commitment. And Julie thought there was more than was appropriate. But Lionel said, "Well, look, it's kind of interesting. Julie, why don't you try to see what you can do with Tom in terms of a deal?" So that was the end of June. The company shut down for the first 2 weeks in July, or at least much of the company did, because if you're developing a product and your engineering department's working and your graphics department is not working, and it's very hard to coordinate the development of a product. So everybody left, except for manufacturing, left the first 2 weeks in July. And then Julie was going to try to engage with Tom. And so it got to be about the end of August, the beginning of September. And I turned to Julie one day and I said, "Julie, what's going on with the cube?" And he said, "Nothing's happening with the cube." He said, Tom and I've spoken a couple of times, the Hungarians want us to commit for 1 million units at a rather high price, about 3.25. And it just doesn't make any economic sense. And, if we want to do a deal, this was on a Monday, Lionel or I have to be in Budapest on Wednesday to do the deal. And I said, well, he said, Lionel's not going to go to Germany, to Hungary, and I'm not going to go to Hungary. I said, "Well, I think the cube's kind of cool. Would you object if I spoke to Lionel and maybe I can go?" And he said, "Look, you want to talk to Lionel about it? By all means." So I went in to see Lionel, who was the president of the company, and I said to him, "Lionel, I understand you're going to be in Budapest on Wednesday." And he laughed. And he said, "I'm not going to Hungary." And I said, "Well, I like the cube. I think it's kind of cool, and I think it would be good for the line. Do you mind if I go?" And he said, "You really want to do that?" He said, "Yeah, I really want to do that." He said, "Well, what kind of a deal do you think you can do?" So I went back to my office and I put together a proposal, and he said, "Okay, well, let me discuss it. You and I and Julie and the head of finance at that time, we'll all sit down together and we'll talk about it." So the four of us sat down and I told him what I thought we could kind of deal I could structure. And he said, well, you still have to get a visa and it takes time to get a visa. I said, look, it's Monday. You're supposed to be there on Wednesday. If the Hungarians want us there, I'm sure I can get a visa today or tomorrow, the latest, be on a plane tomorrow night. I can be in Budapest on Wednesday. So he said, well, see what you can do. So immediately we called the Hungarian consulate. We arranged for the visa. I called Tom Kramer, who was going to meet me or meet Lionel or whoever was the ideal representative, told him I was coming instead. And with that, I flew out Tuesday night to London, where I met Tom Wednesday morning. And Tom said, okay, you have to have the authority to sign the deal. I said, I have the authority to sign the deal if we can come up with a good deal. He said, well, that's great. He said, I have a great marketing plan for it. Well, I said, really, what's that? He said, we're going to call it Inca Gold. This was at the time that there was a phenomenon in the United States called pyramid power. And Tom had this idea that he was going to change the face of the cube so that it was all gold and that there were going to be different characters on the faces. And if you manipulated it in such a way that all the characters aligned, that somehow or other you would be imbued with this superpower, similar to the power you were supposed to get from pyramid power. I said, Tom, I don't think that's a very good idea. I said, what's appealing about the cube is that it's manipulable, the colors, the simplicity of it. And I think that we should just simply go with the basics. And he said, well, we can talk about that. I said, fine. And with that, we flew off to Budapest. We got to Budapest about noon. We were picked up. We went immediately to the offices of Consumex. And I was introduced to Alexander Martin Fee. And with that, we then went off to see the manufacturing operation. And in those days, it was a pretty primitive operation. It was mostly what were called cottage industries. And so what would happen is that the manufacturing, the actual place where they would take the molds and they had the presses would make the pieces, and then those pieces would be farmed out to sort of some places, essentially cottages, home workers, where they would be assembled and put together. And so I saw the operation, I saw what their capacity was, asked how long it took for a tool to be manufactured, what the cycle times were, and so forth. And with that, I went back to the hotel and had dinner that night with Tom, Tibor, and for the first time I met Erno Rubik. And we were seated at the hotel at the Sheraton, which was on the Buda side of Budapest. That's the Buda side is where the castle was, and it's the elevated portion of Budapest, separated by the Rhine River, and Pest is on the other side.
Okay.
And I said to Erno, he said, what's happening? And I said, well, I'm here to try to negotiate a deal, but I was told that before I can negotiate any deal, I have to see whether the puzzle can actually be solved. And he said, sure, I can solve it, no problem. He gave me a cube, I mixed it up, and then he solved it. And then he started to put in different configurations. He'd made the cross and the corners and did all sorts of manipulations. So I was quite comfortable that it would be solved. And then we had dinner together, and Erno was a very mild, modest guy. And as we were walking back from dinner, he said to me, do you think I'll ever make any money on this? And I said, well, I can't guarantee that, Erno, but what I can guarantee is that I'll tell, if part of the negotiation, I will tell the people at Consumex that I need you to come to Toy Fair, because somebody has to demonstrate that the cube is solvable, and you're the only person I know that can do it. So if nothing else, you'll get a trip to the United States. So he said, that sounds pretty good. And with that, I went back. And then the next day, we got involved in a negotiation with Consumex, who was representing Polytechnica, because Polytechnica couldn't negotiate because they didn't have the rights to engage in a contract with a company outside of the Eastern Bloc. Consumex had that right. But Polytechnica obviously had to approve it. So we negotiated a deal, and that night I called the office and said, here are the terms of the deal that I have negotiated, which was similar to what I had talked about before. And after some discussion, Lionel and Julie and Joe Winkler, who was head of finance, said, okay, we can live with that. And they said, what are we going to name it? I said, well, I want to name it the Gordian Knot, the unsolvable puzzle. I assume you know what the story of the Gordian Knot is.
Yes. Yes.
Lionel said, Yeah, Stewart, it's much too esoteric. We're gonna have to come up with another name, but negotiate the rights. So with that, I went back the next day, and actually, it was we're now in Friday, and there was a fair, a trade fair, which Consumex was participating in. So I went to the trade fair, and Alexander Martinfi and I negotiated the contract, negotiated the deal, and signed it. And Saturday, I flew back to the United States, and that was the story of how we acquired the rights to Rubik's Cube. A sub note: you'll notice that I didn't, at that time, with the cube, didn't have a name.
Mm-hmm.
And there were two parts to this negotiation in addition to the price. The packaging was one of them. The package itself was, in Hungary, was just a little blue box, and it was named Búvas Kocka, which meant magic cube in Hungarian. And I explained to the Hungarians that, one, the little box wasn't going to be appropriate. I wanted to put it in what I called a jewel case kind of a box package, which would be a clear package that would allow people to see the cube, because that was what was so engaging about it. It was the size, the colors, and the simplicity of it. And so that was part of the price. And the other was that we would have the right to name it, because Búvas Kocka, or Magic Cube, I didn't think was going to be appropriate. They agreed to those terms. But it was Hungary as a company that was a land-based company, landlocked company, a country, and historically very involved as a trader. That is TRADER.
Mm-hmm.
And very famous for negotiating. There used to be a joke about Hungarians, which was that if a Hungarian enters a revolving door behind you, he comes out in front. And very much,
that sums it up very well.
this was very much the nature of the negotiation. There was always an issue that was left open that had to be resolved in kind of a crisis mode, which gave the Hungarians some leverage.
Mm-hmm.
So I came back to the United States. We had the deal, but we didn't have a name. So several of us in the marketing department and the games area, we all sort of noodled around for a couple of weeks trying to think of a name. One morning, I said, I was preparing for the marathon at that time. I was doing my morning run. And I said, we should just name this thing Rubik's Cube. After all, it tells the whole story. And so I went back, and sort of reluctantly, Lionel said, yeah, not a bad idea. And so I had to go back to Hungary. I actually made 9 trips to Hungary in 18 months. I went back to Hungary, gave Erno $1, and Ideal got the rights to the name Rubik for Rubik-related products. And that's how we got the name Rubik's Cube.
Okay, so if I were to go back to the beginning of that story, basically, had you not been willing to go to Hungary when everyone else in the company thought wasn't worth the trip, Ideal wouldn't have made the Rubik's Cube.
That's true. Nor would any other company in the United States, because Tom had presented it to all of those companies back in March, and nobody had evidenced any interest in it.
So it's a little bit of serendipity involved there, I would say.
I would say there was a lot of serendipity. The fact that Tom met Tibor at the Ravensburg booth, the fact that Tom brought it to the United States, the fact that I was anxious to demonstrate that I could do something more than just simply market toys. Yes, I think there were a lot of elements that made it fortunate.
Okay. Now I'm going to move forward just a little bit. You've got the rights. You're going to be making the cubes. You're going to be presenting them. And then you had mentioned you wanted Erno to come over for the toy fair.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, Erno had never been in the West. He was interested in architecture, which is why I thought he'd like New York. So I arranged for him to come to New York, and we had set up a place for him at Toy Fair where he could demonstrate it. And I decided that I didn't live in Manhattan, although I was usually in Manhattan for Toy Fair most of the time, that Erno would have to learn how to navigate himself from the hotel to the showroom. So the first day that we were there, I took Erno from the hotel to the showroom on the subway. And the second day, I took him from the hotel to the showroom by subway. By about the third or fourth day, I figured that he was capable of going on his own, and he did. And he was able to navigate. It wasn't that difficult from Midtown to the showroom. The showroom was 23rd Street in Broadway, 205th Avenue. Actually, it was 1107, but same thing. And so Erno then would present it at Toy Fair. And we had, in order to engage the buyers, we would say to them, if you can solve one side, we'd give you $5. And if you can solve two sides, we'd get you 10 or 50 or 100, I don't know. And just to get them to get their hands on the cube.
And get them playing with it.
Sure, absolutely.
Yes.
That was the whole idea.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And so Erno would then demonstrate it in lots of different ways, and the buyers were all captivated by it. It was obviously it was going to be a success from the moment Erno presented it.
Rubik's Cube was quite different than any toy Ideal had done to that point. Therefore, the marketing was also quite different. Stewart explained that to us.
Well, the marketing behind this plan was different than a traditional toy. Mm-hmm. So when early on, I felt that this was, if we were going to be successful, we had to market it as much to adults as kids, because if it was going to be a phenomenon and adults were going to play with it, they wouldn't play with it if it was perceived as a toy. They wanted it as a puzzle. And to me, with the appeal of the cube was that it actually was like two puzzles which I had played with as a kid, and many people had played with at least one. The first was the 15 puzzle. I don't know if you know the 15 puzzle, but the 15 puzzle is that 15 tiles that are in a self-contained.
They're a little two-dimensional.
A little frame, and you move it around, you try to create the number. The other was that about 5 years before, I think it was Parker Brothers it was Bradley actually, had sold a product called Instant Insanity. And Instant Insanity were 4 cubes in the exact same color as the cubes, the Rubik's Cube, but they were all freestanding. And the idea was to line the 4 cubes up in such a way that all the colors on each of the sides was the same and that the ends were the same. And so to me, it was a 3-dimensional version of the 15 puzzle and Instant Insanity. And so I wanted to create this feeling of a challenge that puzzles normally create. And so we did a couple of things. The first thing that we did was we created displays that could be put on the shelves at the major retailers where people could actually try to manipulate it themselves. The second thing that we did was we created a teaser campaign, which was placed in the puzzle department, the puzzle section, the finance section, the sporting goods section of major newspapers, which said, if you think this is a hard problem, try to solve Rubik's Cube. And without telling them what Rubik's Cube was, we just did that. And so next to the crossword puzzle, or next to the Wall Street, the market state positions, or next to what was going on in the sporting world, if you think this is hard, let's see if you can solve Rubik's Cube. The third thing that we did was we had a press conference on the East Coast and a press conference on the West Coast, where we invited the print media and other media to hear the story of the cube. And we had essentially 2 people who would tell the story, in addition to ourselves. One of being Zsa Zsa Gabor, who was the most well-known Hungarian personality in the United States at the time. And she was really there just to bring people in to see Zsa Zsa. And the other was a professor of mathematics. I think he was from the University of Pennsylvania, who had was familiar with the cube, who was familiar with the mathematics behind the cube and could give it some credibility. And so very early on, the first thing that happened was there was an article shortly after Toy Fair, I think it was in the international edition of Newsweek, talking about interesting products that came out of the Toy Fair, and one of them was the cube. We didn't get a lot of immediate response from the press, and we were disappointed to the press conferences. However, what did happen was that in the August issue of Omni magazine, not Scientific American as Wikipedia says, but Omni, there was an article talking about the cube and asking people to come up with solutions as to how this worked. And in the September issue, they promised they would reveal the most interesting ideas and also what the actual puzzle looked like. And so that was the first real authenticity or article which verified that this was really a serious product, not just simply an amusing toy for kids.
Mhm.
Well, by that time, so in roughly September, we had now had product on the shelf and it was moving. And we were then in a crisis mode. Probably we were started in June or July looking for alternative manufacturing sources because it took us a little while to build the tools to manufacture the cube. And then we started putting together additional product in order to be able to meet what was obviously the developing demand by that time for Toy Fair.
Okay, so this thing kind of had the ball had to start rolling. People had to start figuring out what it was because it really didn't fit any category. I mean, it wasn't a toy, it wasn't a game, it was both.
Right. And then, of course, we had the television commercial to hype it as well. And our television commercial didn't have kids in it. It had adults. There were three parts to the commercial. It was a 30-second commercial. The first part showed Sir Isaac Newton underneath a tree with an apple falling on his head. But as he was falling as it hit his head, he was playing with the cube. He was not distracted by the apple. So he was more interested in the cube than he was in gravity.
Yes.
It had a woman who was a professor playing with it. And the third had a baseball player who was supposed to be, he was in the dugout and supposed to go back out into the field. And his manager was frustrated with it because all he was doing was playing with the cube. So he tried to position it as kind of a fun product that was suitable for adults as well as for kids. And the combination of all of those things sort of got it rolling.
As in fact, I vaguely remember seeing that commercial on television.
Well, you could
Especially
go to
the Isaac
Newton
Newton part.
You can find it. It's there.
Yeah, I remember the Isaac Newton thing specifically. That the apple hits him in the head and just ignored it.
Yep, exactly right.
Oh, that is quite an amazing story, and I feel lucky to have been able to talk to somebody who was involved with that so much. I mean, your involvement was not just, oh, I met Erno Rubik. This was kind of your baby to some extent. Had you not stepped up, it wouldn't have happened.
Even today, events where people try to solve the Rubik's Cube as fast as possible, which today is referred to as speed cubing, take place all over the world. Ideal Toys and Stewart Sims got this started back in the early 1980s. Stewart explains.
By the way, there's one more part to the story, which is the second year. So from the beginning, I'd always thought we should have a contest to see who could solve the cube.
Mm-hmm.
So very early on, my idea was also to sponsor a contest. But the insurance companies were very reluctant to do that because they knew that somebody would solve it. It was going to be $1 million to the first person to solve the cube. Well, fortunately, we didn't do it quite that way because we had people solving the cube as soon as it was distributed. There were people who were interested in the math behind it, who were puzzlers. So we did test a couple of little pilot sort of contests. I remember the first in Burlington Mall and on a Sunday morning in July. But what happened was the cube became very popular and the idea of a contest continued to permeate. And ultimately we were contacted by, at that time, a television program called That's Incredible, which had John Davidson and Kathy Lee Crosby and Fran Tarkington. And they wanted us to promote a contest where they would then feature the fastest cube solution on television. They'd have the contest would ultimately culminate in a contest on television. And so we coordinated with Six Flags and had regional contests, ultimately leading to a nationally televised contest, which was in November, just before Thanksgiving, the second year. And by that time, the cube was a real phenomenon. I mean, we had a hard time sort of controlling all the publicity because people knew what the cube was and they knew it was a solvable, almost insolvable problem, and it became synonymous with insolvable problems. And it would appear in advertising, it would appear on covers of magazines, and ultimately the contest. And of course, that contest led to what are now speed contests that are held annually all over the world.
We at the Kruger Street Toy and Train Museum would like to thank Mr. Sims for sharing this amazing story with us today. And thank you, the viewer, for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll hope to see you here for the next episode of Kruger Street Stories. Well, that's it for today's episode of Kruger Street Stories. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, press our circular logo on this page to subscribe, and click on the thumbnail to watch this next episode we know you'll also enjoy.